Thank you. I just want to introduce our speaker this evening, Dr. Peter Moore. Pete Moore's books focus on the way in which science and technology arise from human creativity and, in a reflexive fashion, shape not only how we live, but who we are as human beings. Now, Pete has a very interesting background and brings a range of experiences to his work. He is both a scientist, so specialising in physiology, working in a very interesting area we were just discussing about how and why we breathe when we're born, which is a much more complex question than it first appears. Pete is also himself a Christian, but he also works as a journalist and also delivering science communication training and education as well. So it brings a multifaceted set of experiences to his paper today. And he'll be talking about augmented consciousness, hope, hype, heaven or hell. So we will have plenty of time for questions at the end. So without further ado, Pete.
Thank you. It's good to be here with you this evening, and thank you very much for the invite. My route into this as a subject came when the Science Museum asked me to write a book on human enhancement. And I'd previously written a book called Being Me, so it seemed sensible that the next one should become Enhancing Me. And within the frame of that, I wandered around the country talking to people who are involved in various areas of what sometimes is called enhancement science. Enhancement, I felt, was quite close to augmentation. So the two sort of slightly drew from a similar space. And as I went through that book, there's a story of the person who's going to the theatre, and they walked in and checked their seat ticket, and there, where their seat was, there was a man lying across it. And they gave this chap a poke and said, "Do you intend to move?" And he said, "No." Chap went out, found the usher came in, gave him a poke. To be honest, he wasn't looking in good shape, and there's a broken wine glass on the floor and saliva dribbling out of his mouth a bit. And he said, "It's really important that you move. Can you move?" And he said, "No." Usher goes out and gets the policeman. The policeman comes in and said, "Look, this is pretty reprehensible. The play's just about to start. Where do you come from?" To which he said, "The balcony." Within this territory, asking the right question is quite key. Time. I don't know if any of you get time. I picked that one up in Oslo Airport on Monday. And I was told that we're going to live to 142 years. Or rather, if you're born this year, apparently this baby could live to 142 years. Within that, there's a little word called could, which is quite important to then unpack and to ask some appropriate questions about it. And as soon as we start talking about augmentation or enhancement, we've got to start listening quite carefully about the questions that people are asking of each other and the challenges they're setting each other, and to work out what on earth are we talking about. Before I get to consciousness, because consciousness is quite tricky. Francis Crick called it the hard problem. Yeah, that's sort of minor. It's quite difficult to put your fingers on consciousness. I thought it was a good example to have a look around lifespan expectancy and talk about enhancing that and augmenting that, because that's easier. You can count that one. We can actually ask some simple questions around that one. And it becomes, the rhetoric behind this is much more interesting to me than actually the numbers at times. So what's going on in the mindset when you want to live to 140 and beyond? And one of the early articles in this section inside Time started to expand that a little bit. So 30 or more extra years of life means that we can improve the way we live. Well, that's an interesting statement, but I'm not sure it's entirely provable. Just because you're going to live 30 years longer is not ipso facto that it's going to be great. Let's put that to one side, maybe. But that was the rhetoric that's running. To the extent that we can build a world where people arrive at old age mentally sharp, physically fit, and financially secure, the problems of individual aging will recede. Well, yes, but you've got to look at the premise of the first part of the sentence. To the extent at which we can deliver entirely healthy elderly people who are financially equipped and unburdened, of course things are going to recede. But that's a given that's running through in part of the dialogue that goes along. When we go into it, they start talking about the age disruptor, and the one that they're talking about at this time is an antibiotic, rapamycin, and in particular a little mouse who's been taking this for a bit, snappy little name, UT2598, and this mouse is excitingly 3 years old. Should have died at 2.5 years, or just under. But by sucking this chow, he's made it to 3. And they've actually had one that made to 4. And that is, that to an extent is quite something to get a mouse that's 4 years old. So there is something going on in that space that's intriguing. And if you simply apply the maths across into human years and mouse years, then you'll land up at 140. And then when you read the rest of the article, there's a great big ish. They sort of add to it. And that 140-ish might actually be 80, but let's just leave it at 140 at the moment-ish. Get inside and you talk to the scientist involved, and he basically says, well, I'm 72, but I'm not going to take the stuff, because it screws you up. It gives you diabetes, it gives you cataracts, it gives you all sorts of things. So, go easy on this stuff, because I'm not going to touch it. Didn't change the front page in the Times declaration that these children are going to live to 142. Probably if they don't take the drug, they've got a better chance of making it to 50. And then they paint along the bottom here a series of happy birthday cakes, which up until this point is fact. So if you're born in 1925 in America, your average expectancy was 59. Move on 30 years, 70, move on, move on. I'll pop that as a graph so we can see what's going on here. I like graphs. I'm a graphy sort of person. So if we set up a graph of life expectancy at birth, if you're in America, and post up the size, note we're starting at 40 here, move into 1925, and our chance is 59. Go on 30 years, 1955, and we're now at 70. Go on 30 years, 75, 215, 79. Now, the observant of you will note that the increment is getting less and less. So what's the expectation by the time we add another 30 years to it? Well, that was the game. The trend is there. Actually, forget the increment to 2045. What the people, and Time was just taking its comments from the scientists quoting in it. They weren't building a front cover. Don't knock the journalists on this one, not the deliverers. They didn't actually talk in the article about 2045 at all. They were talking about someone who's 3 years old now, as in 2012. And the story they're telling is that 2012, you're going to live to 140. So we've got an increment of 21, of 5, of 4. Oops, no, we want that increment now to be 65 from nowhere. So we just listen quite carefully as we go through some of this territory as to what we're actually talking about. What we're actually talking about here is a situation where, as age progresses, how many people live there, you get a bell curve. We get bell curves all over the place. It's probably a skewed bell curve, but I can't make Outlook do a skewed bell curve for me, so we'll just have a simple one. The chances of you breaking a human record in longevity is distinctly remote. The chances of you living closer to the human record is increasing. The consequence is the bell curve is getting squashed up. So the average is moving up the line at the moment, but it's getting harder and harder to push up the line, while the top maximum is showing very little sign of moving at all. If you put that out into Google's mapping or Wikipedia's mapping of supercentenarians, the people who are above 110, and there's so few you can count them quite easily. If we take the subset of the above 115s, in the history of recorded mankind, there's 35 people who've made it above 115. Move that up to 116, and you go down to 10. 117, and you go down to 5. 119, and there's 2 of them. And the world record breaker, bless her, died at 122. And there is no mass cohort of people ready to race beyond this boundary. There is no evidence of a huge cluster that's coming along. And actually, there's a lot of evidence that we are killing our children with sugar and that they're never going to make our lifespan, much less beat us. The extent of obesity and diabetes added together and the conflicting views of those two, or aspects of those two, is going to be quite substantial. Hype. Hope, heaven, hell. Well, I don't want to shorten my life. I do have a hope. I also do have another hope that this isn't the only part of it. And as a Christian, that carries its own distinct flavour. The hype is considerable at the moment. And we've got to be careful not to be oversold. One of my village compatriots is Steve Webb, pensions minister. Like him or not, nice guy. But actually I'm trying to get him persuaded to the fact that we don't need to extend our pension policy to fund millions of people who are over the age of 120. Because actually once we start the hype, it has severe consequences to political planning and fiscal planning in all sorts of territories. We need some distinct realism before we go mad. Heaven? The tricky thing is that by the time you've made it there at the moment, life is pretty restricted. And I was fascinated by the talk on dementia this morning. And if you were there, it was a beautiful one. And as a child of 2 parents who are in their late 80s, quite poignant in spaces as to what I do. But it's not a heavenly place to be. I don't know if you spotted Alfie in the press recently. Australia's oldest chap. I mean, he's got a great life, but his life is now knitting jumpers for penguins, which he does at about one every couple of months. So penguins who survive oil spills need jumpers. And it works jolly well for them, apparently. And I'm not going to say whether that's heaven or hell as a life, but it's kind of more restricted than most of us are. And it's not the ideal space to be. I don't think we would argue. So we need some careful thinking. Aubrey de Grey, has anyone come across Aubrey? Fascinating character. It's always best to get him at the beginning of his session in the bar. He went to the Perpetual Church, the Church of Perpetual Life. That's an interesting organisation. He's not a member, but he was a speaker there. All we have to do is to get rid of aging is to remember, he effectively says that we're a machine, and like any machine, so long as you repair the parts each time they fall over, the machine can keep running, just like a vintage car. I'm not sure we're quite like a machine to that extent. All we have to do to stop this is stop atrophy, stop cancer, stop gene mutations, stop mutations in mitochondria, stop proteins linking together, nasty little things, because that's what makes your eyes. So I've got varifocal glasses now because all the proteins have linked together and that sponginess is gone. Stop junk proteins building up and stop junk building up outside the cells. That's all you've got to do. By the way, if you miss one of those, it won't work, because the one you miss will be the one that kills you. Now, he still is wheeled out to conferences and dinner parties and all the rest, at great expense and great excitement, because people love to hear it. They want to hear the hope that they mightn't die. There's a lot of super rich people who are actually quite keen to fund him, just in case he can pull it off. Because having amassed a couple of billion, it's actually very difficult to spend a couple of billion in a normal lifespan. Even if you spend it at £1 million a day, you won't achieve it. So some of these folks would like to extend it, and giving him the money is quite a good way. Well, it's as good as anyone. But recognize you've got quite a lot to achieve quite quickly if we're going to pull it off. Where are we within this space? I've changed my views in a number of ways, but I now would be a view holder that we do have a distant ancestor, and we have grown from that space. And part of the wonder of the human being is that quest to change, and quest to advance, and quest to enhance, and quest to augment. It started with fire and clothing. It's very difficult to find very many areas of the world that you can populate if you can't light a fire, because you'll die in the winter. It's very difficult to live in very many places of the world if you can't knit a blanket, or at least skin something bigger than you so you can nick it and live in what it left behind. The consequence was moving out of some fairly rare parts of Africa was absolutely driven and required us to be inventive and to enhance our capability and to augment what we're capable of doing. And that does have a distinct effect on your physiology as you respond to it. Our ability to change our physiology, your risk of heart disease, age 40 to 50, is most strongly linked to your grandmother's diet while your mother was in the womb. That is the thing that is the biggest risk factor over any of you having heart disease aged 40 to 50. Your present life, well, prior to procreation, and during procreation in particular, has a high impact on the genes and the epigenetics that you pass on to the next generation. So acquiring fire will change your genome down the line. It will change your stature. It will change your entire structure. Out of which Homo sapiens move along. And I think we're now sort of asking, what would Homo augmented look like? I'm not sure. So let's wander over to consciousness for a moment. Consciousness, Francis Crick called it a hard question. Just remember there's going to be a bit of hype floating around within the hope, quite possibly. But let's think of inputs, processing, and outputs. There's some very interesting things going on in where's technology going. So cochlear implants are one way of completely changing the way that people who can't hear can hear. So the cochlea is the bit that vibrations turn into nerve signals, and the auditory nerve then carries it off into the brain. You can put a processor which picks up a signal. We'll work out where the signal comes from in a moment. And that then feeds to an electrode that you feed inside the cochlea. On the outside of the head, you then put something that looks like a hearing aid, except what it's doing is it's sending a signal across into this processor. The consequence of that is that you can go from being completely deaf to a form of hearing. The little processor is nice and small. This bit is tiny. That's one that gets fed. The cochlea is a bit like a snail shell, and it gets fed round inside. And you can see the electrodes. There's about 20 of them. So you have 20 points of feeding code into the nervous system. I mean, it's remarkable if you've been deaf. You sitting here now, probably, however, have 20,000, if not 200,000 nerves traveling in your auditory nerve, each of which is sending a unique signal in. They're effectively going to have 20. Now, as a medical device, brilliant. As something which is taking us somewhere we've never been before, I'm not convinced yet. And just saying, well, okay, this is the early one, we'll scale up, isn't quite so simple. Because once you've gone to a bigger, to a finer resolution, you've got to get rid of all movement. And we're talking about movement at the level that if it moves a micron, that would change everything. In a system where you've got a heartbeat that's making it move 0.5 millimeters. So maybe you just turn the heart off, but apparently that's not so good. So the technical next stage is enormous. You know, another potential one is to forget about the cochlea entirely and put the implant onto the nerve. It's a rather nice diagram. Actually, the only way you do that is by surgically removing the whole of that area to get there. So you have to destroy the whole of it in order to gain access. So it's a nice little diagram, but you don't want to know what the real way of getting in there is, because it doesn't sound so good. Retinal implants are quite clever. But again, let's just work out what they're actually capable of doing. French neuf. It takes quite some time to recognize that that is a 9. Okay? So these are terrific. He was completely blind before, and he's now at a stage where actually you can begin to pick up some things. If we... Don't worry about the sound too much on this. So what this guy is now doing is just explaining what it's like to see through one of these visual devices. And the camera we're using here, we're all used to our megapixels and our thousands of millions of pixels. What someone with an artificial retina has is 60 pixels. So here we've got a multi-thousand one, and it's now dropping down, it's black and white. And he says in the 60 pixel environment you can still see, well you can at that, but that's a 1,000 pixel. This is the 60 pixel environment. And okay, you've got a little bit of a sense that there's something going out there, but I think that's quite a long way away from vision. And again, we've got a monster problem scaling that back to vision. Monster problems are solved sometimes. And she's talking about a firework display and how fun it was to watch the firework display. And again, the way that this is put over graphically, that's not a 60, that's a 60 pixel. And they quickly come back out of it to give you the feeling that actually it's a long way ahead of where it is in terms of reality. They're good, they're enormous, they're interesting. Part of my interest here is what's the aspiration that lies behind the desire to have them? Where's the hope, where's the hype? Why are we wanting to do these? Now, this is a medical aspiration. There's another potentially. Why have a normal camera? Why not put an infrared camera on your head and feed it in? How about having a sound signal? How about having a radioactive detector signal? So you could see in all sorts of other input devices. Now, when you go down there, we're into a different aspiration entirely as to what we're trying to do to ourselves. Todd Huffman, interesting guy. It's a photograph I took of him just outside Paddington Station a couple of years ago. The little dot on his face there is a bolt that he's had surgically fixed onto his cheekbone so he can put baubles on at Christmas. He likes augmenting himself. To be honest, I think he'd do better without the bauble, but there we go. He's also got a magnet in his finger. There's a number of people who are putting magnets in their fingers. The consequence of that is that when he's near an oscillating magnetic field, like a motor, he can feel it buzz. Now, is that a new sensation? He's claiming that this is turning him into a completely unmet before human being, with a new consciousness of the world around him, because his finger buzzes when he's near a processor. It raises an interesting thought, but I don't think it's actually taken us into an entirely new space. But it does raise the idea that we could actually have different modalities that our current senses can pick up and do something with. Neil Harbisson claims to be the world's first cyborg. Lots of people like to claim to be the world's first cyborg. We've had quite a lot of them, and he's another world's first cyborg. He's got a camera that sits on his head. He's colorblind, and as it sees a color, it plays a tone. He's now glued the transducer onto his skull at the back, so he can never take this thing off. And it's there day and night, and whenever he sees a color, it goes bzzz. If it looked at you, goodness knows what sound it would make. And it goes a sort of mushy sound at that point, or it flips quickly between, because it only plays one tone at a time. So as he looks around, he'd pick up the red of a jumper and the white of the shirt and the blue of it. I think it might be quite distracting. I'm not sure I'd want to be in a car driven by him with the noise going on. I think the day and nightness that he's now got of it could cause him trouble in a few years' time, as it vibrates through his head, and he hears it because his skull vibrates, and that sets his ears vibrating, and then he hears. So there are all sorts of ways that people are playing with our sensations to see if we can stretch further. One of the things I get out of this, though, hope, hype, heaven or hell, is actually, we have been, I think someone said, quite wonderfully made. So wonderfully made that it is proving really quite difficult, with all our capability, to squeeze that wonder further. I'm not saying it's going to be impossible. I'm not saying we're never going to do it. I'm not saying we haven't already done remarkable things. I quite like my varifocal glasses. I don't like having to wear varifocal glasses, but I like the fact I need them, that someone's come up with a phenomenal maths solution. I have a spherical lens with a cylinder running diagonally across it. How do you do the maths on that one? That then varies intensity from top to bottom and then fits onto a curved surface to fit into my glasses. And it works. I don't know how. We are really clever. So there are some clever things slipping, but we are also deeply wonderful to a level that our cleverness is just scratching surfaces. Processing. Well, we're going to stop in a few minutes' time. And it was at the 30-minute wave, so you've got a few minutes more. I did request a 30-minute wave so that you did get home at some point this evening. And not sure if you'll call in for some alcohol on the way home. There's caffeine available, and you had a choice of caffeine or no caffeine, drugs or no drugs, as I call it. I've gone pretty well no drugs, since in the past I got addicted to caffeine to the extent I had to get up during the night to have coffee to get back to sleep again. And once you're on 5 jugs in the morning, that's what happens in the evening. And once you've started, and actually, if you're folks who need a cup of coffee in the morning, you could save that by just stopping. Because if you think, actually, I can't really work until after my cup of coffee, give it a couple of weeks, and you will work just as well without than with. All you do with your cup of coffee is return yourself to the level of someone who doesn't take caffeine, operates in any case. And quite soon, you then need the second cup of coffee, just to get back to it. Once you're someone who needs 3 cups, actually, you'll never get back to a good level, and you're always operating sublimit to the person who never had it in the first place. I walk down our high streets at the moment with the explosion of coffee shops, thinking, what the heck's going on here? I don't understand it, actually. It's an intriguing addiction that we've mapped onto ourselves in the last couple of years. It's a new phenomenon. Particularly supposedly during a recession, the £4 cup of coffee is obligatory. It doesn't map at all. Nicotine. And back there, I mean, one of the most terrifying things is getting rid of cigarettes and replacing them with e-cigarettes, which are a much more potent source of nicotine. And your nicotine load goes up substantially. It's not a wonderful thing to take on board. Okay, the carcinogens aren't there. But do remember the nicotine, and it's good to phase that one out as well. Then we move on to the slightly less everyday. So alcohol. 9-month study, though, showed it increased only by 4.5 ID. And this wasn't given to the smartest people. Okay, when you give it to the smartest people, it's very, very difficult. You've got to set up really clever trials to spot the differences. And again, what we're in a territory is that we're not pushing the top, but we're rescuing some of the bottom towards a much more sustainable level. So when you've got the very bright students taking it, they will be taking it at a higher than on-label license to get an effect, and the majority effect that they'll be getting is irregular heartbeats, anxiety, euphoria, and some of the side effects that actually are not so smart. So the smart kids don't take smart drugs. But if you're not smart, you can squeeze yourself up there a little bit. Ritalin, people who take it say, okay, but I'm just a bit tunnel visioned. I can think clearly, but I can't imagine. Joshua Foe looked into this. He's a journalist in America, and then he started some memory enhancement drugs, which didn't do him very good. And then he went to the American Memory Championships as a journalist, and then went back the next year as a participant. And in the meantime, they gave him some training, and they said, go play golf and learn a golf course. And then when you're faced with the task of 52 cards, just place each card in your mind against each golf stroke you play. And for some people, apparently, if an 18-course, 3-par course, they'll play 54 strikes. For me, it would be about 200, but for some people, it's only 54. So you've got plenty of places for your 52 cards. He taught himself to learn a pack of cards, the sequence of a shuffle pack of cards in 1 minute 40. The world champion can do it in 30 seconds. I can't go through 52 cards in 30 seconds, much less memorize their sequence. And that you then recount after an hour's delay. So that's learn and recall. Actually, we are wonderfully made. Ha! It's difficult to squeeze that one up. It's difficult to squeeze it up. You know, these guys won things. We then discovered they were taking a few drugs. I'm more interested in the guys who are immediately behind, who weren't. Now, in a world where medals do go on hundredths of seconds, yeah, okay, there was a slight difference. But these can all run blooming quickly without it. Again, we're pretty good, and our technology gets the poor people up to a good status, but we're struggling to get the good people up to a higher one. Modafinil, when we did it, it stops you going to sleep. It also has a tendency, if you use it for too long, and all the trials stop at 70 hours. American military uses goes on for weeks, at which point paranoia is a strongly recorded event. And the court case that followed the shooting, the bombing of the Canadian soldiers on the ground, clearly showed paranoid action and mentality within the pilot. Just whip through this, we'll miss that one out for a sec. What would enhanced memory look like? Well, we're thinking about a chip, is what they keep talking about, the idea that you can put pins into your brain. These pins are very small, they're sort of 50 microns wide. To have any hope of working, they've got to be less than a 50th of a micron wide and not move if they're actually going to talk in any consistent way with cells. Maybe we could fire more efficiently. Actually, I'm more interested in forgetting. I'd love to have some enhanced forgetfulness. Because actually, heaven, hype, hope, hell, if you couldn't forget anything, which of those would you be in? In a world where you couldn't forget, well, it's called post-traumatic stress disorder. Forgetful. Can you imagine walking out of this building and remembering every single feature of it? Every crack in every tile? The brilliance of our brain is we don't remember almost everything, but we selectively remember the tiny bit that's important. Now that's difficult to achieve a different way. The interweb gathers everything. Try to find what you're looking for, it's a slightly different one. And if you think Google's finding everything, forget it. Google's just finding what it rather likes you to find. There's a difference. One other processing one, you'll hear about brain spikes, and then we'll move out quite quickly. Parkinson's disease. This is a chap with Parkinson's disease in Australia. And what he's showing you here is a standard test that the clinician gets him to do just to rattle his fingers through to check that he's okay. He's okay because he's got a knitting needle-sized spike into his brain that's sending out pulses from a pacemaker. And that has a remarkable effect of turning off the Parkinson's effect in his body. In a moment or two, that's the controller for his pacemaker. And he's just checking that the pacemaker's on at the moment. And it shows you that it says on and it's running nicely. And in a moment, he's just about to turn this pacemaker off. And already he started shaking. Now that's someone who doesn't have the deep brain stimulating spike. I mean, the difference that occurs when you turn off, and in just a moment he'll turn it back on again.
So, as you can see, almost automatically.
The pace of the change is quite extraordinary. You know, as human beings, we are capable of doing some quite wonderful things in terms of medical therapy. And there are some uses of this potentially for helping people with depression, helping people with pain, and for party goers, what you're effectively doing is setting off word's gone out of my mind, an endorphin. So maybe you put a spike in and then sort of turn on party mode. But you've got to remember you've got a knitting needle in your head. And that's something that probably would be quite high risk. The only thing I'll talk to in terms of output, cognition, you make an assessment of the world, you process it, and then you do something with that. What can we do in terms of measuring what the brain's doing and actually just using that to cause us to be able to do things? It's augmented consciousness. As we look through the space, as you look through the media headlines, as you look through, for me it's very often the press releases that come out on the back of papers published. Because as a journalist, as a science PR person, I watch the whole string through and don't always knock the press. for the hyperbole. But there is hope. We are very good at creating technological items. The need to cause the funding, the need to keep people excited, the need to retain jobs is an easy way of creating hype. But actually, I think it's more than that. I think there is a willingness to aspire to be so much better that causes us to head in that direction. And to an extent, that's really good. But we need to keep it under control and recognize that it's going on. Some of these things aren't heavenly. Some of them are. If you're sat there with Parkinson's, it's wonderful to be able to turn it off. Really wonderful to be able to turn it off. But for me, it then comes back to where the hope lies. And we do have a hope within this space of living well and enduring it. For me, I also extend that beyond to a hope that's a bigger one. And I look forward to putting it off as long as possible, but enjoying it when I get to that bit as well. Thank you for your time.